you. I'm here today with my good friend Katie Harman Ebner, Miss America 2002, and I'm so thankful that you're with us today, Katie. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Pam. It's always such a treat to talk with you.
Well,
Thank
we're
you.
we're going to be talking with our friends in the audience today about miscarriage, stillbirth, and tubal pregnancy. And it's a tough topic to talk about, and unfortunately, a lot of people do not discuss this because there's just a lot of guilt, there's a lot of fears, a lot of things that are attached to this emotionally. But they are expecting you to share your story of the loss that you encountered between your first baby and your third baby.
hmm Oh, and I'm happy to do so. Certainly, that was not a happy time,
No.
like so many who have experienced miscarriage. It was so unexpected for me, and that was really the biggest jolt of it all. After we had Tyler, my husband and I obviously wanted to have more children. And so we began trying and we became pregnant. And I was expecting, based on the previous pregnancy, that all was going to go swimmingly. And around 12 weeks, I started to bleed. And I just knew I had this terrible sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, in my heart. I started to weep. Tim took me to the doctor. Unfortunately, my regular doctor, my OBGYN, was out of town at the time, so I was given a different doctor. And while he was so nice, he it was one of those experiences where I didn't know quite what to expect, and he was very clinical about it all. And I that made me kind of spiral from that point forward, where I was completely anxious from that moment forward. I was sobbing, I was distraught, I was very, very hurt. All of these feelings of what did I do? What did I do wrong? What has happened? This is my baby. I want this baby more than anything in the world. First of all, what caused this? What did I do? Why isn't this doctor giving me more support? What am I supposed to do from here? Where am I supposed to go from here? All of those emotions flooded me at the instant that he said, "You have miscarried." And then it was going home and going forth from there, which was a very, very rocky process. It was a good many months of really going through grief and the many stages of grief. And it wasn't just me dealing with it, it was my husband dealing with it as well. So it was very multi layered. There is so much hurt and there is so much guilt that's associated with a miscarriage or the loss of a pregnancy. And it is very difficult to reconcile those feelings.
Yeah, it is. And so I'm just wondering, and maybe those in the audience are too, were you alone that day when you received this news? And then how did you broach the subject with Tim?
I was not alone. This happened on a weekend, and so he was home from work, and that was really miraculous because he's an F-15 pilot for the Oregon Air National Guard, and more often than not, he is gone. So for him to be there was really by the grace of God. So I was so grateful that I was not alone when it happened. And he accompanied me to the doctor, so I was very, very grateful for that. But in the days after, I felt alone when he had to return to work, when people called in, when as people started to find out. I had so much support in that I had loving friends and obviously a loving family too, and a church support system that was very sympathetic. But I still felt alone. I didn't quite know what to say. I didn't know how to talk about it. And those people who were trying to be a support to me didn't quite know what to say. And I had worked in and around hospice care for a number of years. So I knew clinically how to deal with death. But when it came to me dealing with the loss of a pregnancy, I was suddenly completely mute. I felt very, very alone. And my mother hadn't experienced a miscarriage. And she was also very sensitive to the fact, though, that she didn't want to say the wrong thing to me. And so she told her sister, whom I didn't know this at the time, who had experienced the loss of a pregnancy at 24 weeks, a little boy, and this was before she had my two girl cousins. And my Aunt Vicky knew exactly what to do for me. Because at that time, my mom could see, and my friends could see, and my husband could see that I was closing up. I didn't want to hear anything from anyone. I didn't want any advice. I certainly didn't want to hear, oh, you'll get pregnant again, because I didn't believe it. I didn't trust it. At that point, I was very untrusting of anything involving the process. But Aunt Vicky knew that it wasn't so much the words, or that there weren't necessarily words that I needed to hear from anyone particular. There were things that I needed to read, things that needed to be reinforced in my spirit, in my soul, in my thought process. And so she handed me her well-worn copy of Pam, your first edition of Empty Arms. And in reading Empty Arms, in scouring those pages for hope, for answers, for all of the things that were lost to me at that moment, it's as if everything that I was looking for jumped off the page at me. And of course, I was enveloped in not only the love that Pam, that you poured into your words, for those who were trying to support me. I had less of a feeling of being alone, and I had this nudging to go forward, that I could go forward.
Yeah. How was it that you would bring the topic up with others in ways that helped you?
It's such a difficult topic. When I have encountered friends, and I'll tell you this, that first edition copy of Empty Arms did not stay with me long. I had it for about a year until a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, went through a series of miscarriages. And I gave her my copy of Empty Arms, which was passed down, of course, from my aunt, which had been given to her by a friend. And we have since marked our names on the inside cover of that book. And so when I handed this copy of Empty Arms to my friend, and I thought long and hard about what was it that she needed to hear from me as I gave her this book. And the first thing I said was, I love you. That's the first thing that you need to hear when you're going through this, to know that when you feel like it's so your fault, you need to feel loved. You need to feel enveloped. You need to be supported. And so it's not as much that she needed to hear, I'm sorry. She knew that I was sorry. She knew that I felt what she felt. But she, more importantly, needed to hear, I love you. She did not need to hear, you'll get pregnant again. She did not need to hear, oh, it'll happen in the right timing. Those were not the things that I needed to hear at that time. And those were not the things that she needed to hear. Now, there are some women who do. This is all subject to personality and to situation. And I'm very, very sensitive to that. But I do know that from my conversations with my friends who have experienced this, the linchpin in starting the process of healing is feeling love. Because at that moment, at the moment that you know that you have lost this child, that motherly instinct, that love that already enveloped you for this child is suddenly overwhelming and stifling, and you feel like it's almost choking you. It's so great. The grief is so great because you've lost this great love. So to feel love from others helps to not feel stifled, to not feel alone.
I think that's so key, because when we are suffering grief, just that alone makes us want to withdraw and retreat. It's kind of like if you touch your finger to the stove and you burn it on the fire, what do you naturally do? You pull back, you retreat. And there's just not a lot of strength to reach out. I love the way, Katie, you reached across the gap and you shared that love. And love is healing. It is powerful healing. Just knowing someone is there with you. When you were dealing with all of those confusing questions that go on right after pregnancy loss, and then you've got the postpartum hormones that are going crazy at the same time, what were some of the anxieties and the fears that you wrestled with in those months afterwards?
Oh, I certainly wrestled with what did I do wrong? That was the first question. That was the first thing that came to mind is what could I have done to prevent this? And more often than not, really, truly, and you can speak to this too, Pam, I don't have a accurate statistic, but I would venture to guess 9 times out of 10, if not closer to like 99% of the time, we don't have an answer. We don't have an explanation. Our doctor's not going to have an explanation. We cannot find explanation even in our biblical search. It's so difficult to pinpoint what it is that caused this miscarriage. And so that made the grappling with that, what could I have done, even worse, because there was no answer.
And I think I want to say something about that before you go on, because I think you really hit on something. We, as human beings, don't tolerate ambiguity very well. We want to know. And part of this is regaining our sense of control, because if we can blame something, then and pinpoint the cause, then we can control it, but not really. Control is kind of an illusion, right? And one of the things the doctor shared with me was that 50% of the animal world are the babies, the infants are lost. 50%. Now, for those of us that are human beings, it's about 1 in 4, 1 in 3, and he explained to me it is nature's way. Now you got to work with that, and then you work with your spiritual questions. Well, how does God fit into all of that? And we prayed for this baby, and does God love me? If he's a good God, why didn't he write a different ending to my story?
Yes. God wanted this baby. Why would God take this baby? Does God not trust me with this baby? Right. Oh yeah, those were absolutely all questions that I asked. And certainly I felt at that time, though, just as you said, Pam, I from hearing from the doctor, the clinical side of things, I wanted to believe that I was not alone in this, but in the midst of that, you feel so alone. You don't quite know how to reach out to others who have experienced it. And for whatever reason, those who have suffered miscarriage or infant loss kind of stay in this cone of silence.
Yeah.
We shouldn't. The first step to kind of getting out of that for me was acknowledging my selfishness and not including my husband in the grieving process. He was grieving right alongside me in his own way. Not in the same way that I was, but I was for a certain amount of time pretty blind to that. And once and it was from reading your book, it was from reading Empty Arms that I acknowledged, oh, hello, there's another person in this, and he needs to be involved. Once Tim and I became involved in the grieving process together, that's when the healing really started to escalate. And when I was able to get out of my own thoughts, get out of my own head, out of my own suffering, and to be able to pour forth those things that were weighing on my heart so heavily, to him first, and then to others who were experiencing or had experienced what I had experienced and was experiencing. That is really where the path to healing began, and where I could finally start to see some hope.
And you just highlighted something so important, because when we try to do this alone, we will move forward much more slowly. Some of the grief research shows that one of the worst things that we can do is isolate, because what that does is it escalates negative ruminating. But when we reach out and we talk about and we write about and share our story with others that are safe and trusted, we heal much more quickly. And I remember the same thing. I would not want to ruin my husband's day by bringing up all this sadness that was going on inside of me, because, he had his own stresses and his own burdens, and just didn't want to put a damper on that. But by not doing so, I was robbing him of our chance to share this oneness that we have as husband and wife, and this unity that's so important, and to kind of open the unspoken can of worms that he's got this similar feelings too.
That's exactly right. And Pim did not deal with those feelings in the same way that I did. And it was really the start of a wonderful conversation about dealing with emotions for us. We had been married at that point about 4, almost 5 years. Actually, just a little bit more, so closer to 6. And it takes a long time, in my opinion, I feel like it takes a long time to really get to know a person when they're grieving.
Yes.
And that was a key pivotal moment in our marriage for us, was me being understanding of that, of him, and vice versa. And I'm so grateful that he was there, but I acknowledge too that we don't always have that. We don't always have a partner to grieve with us.
That's true.
And so my encouragement for women who do not have a partner in this process of healing is to reach for that Empty Arms journal. Grab that copy, because those words, just as I said before, those words are as enveloping with love as any physical arms that you can have wrap around you during this time. And then the second is to not be silent, to seek out the community of women that are around you, that have been through this, that are going through this. You are not alone.
Yeah. I know that you and I both, when we were going through our losses, filled journals with our thoughts and feelings. And I didn't know at the time that writing and putting words to the feelings that I had inside and expressing that in written language, expressive writing, was actually healing in and of itself. And just in the last 10 years came across the brain science research on grief and complicated grief, and found out that 59% of women who have suffered a pregnancy loss actually get stuck in complicated grief, prolonged grief. That is a lot of unnecessary suffering. But I think it's because oftentimes we are isolated and we are not totally comfortable talking about this. So I want to encourage those of you that are listening today. I wish I had known that back then. And that's why I put together the Empty Arms Journal. 20 minutes of writing a day, expressively kind of downloading what's on the inside to the outside, actually can rewire the brain and help your heart heal much more quickly. Yeah. So as you went forward in this process, and the grief is a process that takes much longer than we would prefer it take. I have to say it was probably a good couple of years for me.
For me as well. Absolutely. It's interesting, if any of you have had surgery, and Pam, if you've ever had surgery, invasive surgery, where the doctor will often tell you a timeline of how long it's going to take for you to heal. And I had a surgery a couple of years ago where the doctor said, you really need to stay off your feet for about 6 weeks. And I timed it. I was like, 6 weeks, okay, I'm ready to get back on my feet. It took 3 times longer than that to heal. And when I think about my miscarriage, my heart was ripped open. I needed surgery on my heart. I needed surgery on this immensely important thing in my life, which had been ripped from me, ripped apart. And I was trying to time it based on 6 weeks, or whatever I felt in my head was the appropriate amount of time to grieve. And it took so much longer than that, just like what you said. We can't put a timeline on that. We can't put a timeline on grief. We have to allow ourselves to fully grieve. And that's a part of this process after miscarriage is understanding just how big this was to us, and therefore how much more magnified the healing process is going to be, and how much longer it's going to take. And I don't know, Pam, I'm sure you can speak to this too. I don't know that we fully ever, you don't get over this.
No.
You know, you don't fully heal in the traditional sense that the pieces of your heart will perfectly fuse back together and you will forget what happened. You can never forget. You never fully move on from this. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to. I praise our Heavenly Father for the gift of what came through this process, truly. And I know that baby is in heaven. I know where it is. I know I'll have the opportunity to meet it again, meet him or her. And that provides so much hope. And with my girlfriends who, in our conversations about this, that is so much hope right there. And beyond that, the hope of knowing that we have a Heavenly Father who loves us so much, that he has given us in his word and in our ability to convene with one another and support one another, the ability to really move forward in the knowledge that everything happens for his good.
One of the things that I remember from years ago, I met a woman and she was probably in her 80s. And we were talking about just life in general. And I said, well, how many children do you have? And she mentioned that she had 4 and told me their names. And then she mentioned, and I had a baby on March 3rd, and that she told me the year, and it had been, 60 years before. You don't forget. Women always remember, even if there's been 50 years that have passed, that baby. When you think about the ways that this loss transformed you, how are you different as a result of having moved through this loss, and what are some of the gold takeaways that you have with you today?
It's so important to think about that too in the midst of your healing, is how am I growing through this? How am I being transformed for the good, for the better? How am I understanding myself in not only in grief, but in life and in motherhood, truly? Because once a mother, always a mother. Just as you said, Pam. For me, what I discovered was really how personal grief and experiencing grief is. How I personally now I can acknowledge or identify certain things about my personality, that when I grieve, I know that I am going to experience this. I know that my personality is going to bend in this specific way, and therefore I need to acknowledge that in how I grieve personally. But I'll tell you, it made me a much more empathetic person. And I feel like when you are experiencing grief, sometimes you can become hardened. You can want to wall yourself off and not allow anyone else's grief or any other grief in the world to continue to make you feel sad. If you see or experience other people's grief, you're just going to get more and more sad, and you don't know if you can bear that. And for me, I had a little bit of that at the beginning, where I didn't want to hear. I didn't want to know what other people were going through. But it was in breaking down those barriers and allowing myself to understand hurt that I was able to fully love other people.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I think right after a loss, we're so fragile. Our hearts are so broken, and I remember I couldn't even watch television news or see a sad movie because I was just so fragile. I'd be very careful about what my eyes watched, what my ears heard. Some music would just put me in a puddle immediately,
Naturally is music. So, heavens glory. Yeah, whatever I was triggered by music instantly.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. I was talking with a gal online the other day, and she shared a really cool story of something that happened that was helpful for her. And her husband was with her when they delivered their baby, and the baby was about 6 months along. And after that stillbirth, the Lord had spoken to her husband, and what he heard in his spirit, just in the quietness of his heart, was, "It's not your fault." And I just loved that kindness that just immediately spoke with such clarity to their hearts that no guilt here, no guilt. And I just want to share that with our listening audience today. No guilt. Please know that there is no fault. If there's, you have no control over these kinds of things, and certainly you would not have wanted this to happen. So no guilt, okay? What else would you like to share as a word of encouragement before we wrap up today, Katie?
Oh, certainly I want to encourage those of you who have just experienced a miscarriage, who are right in the thick of this healing process, to absolutely go out and get a copy of Pam's book, The Empty Arms Journal, for the exact reasons that we talked about before, about really getting everything that's in your head out on paper. The thing that I love about the Empty Arms Journal, and I of course have such a strong place in my heart for the original edition of Empty Arms, and the Empty Arms Journal has basically taken everything that Pam has put in the Empty Arms book and now expanded it so that you have an opportunity to physically see your outpouring of thought and emotion and grief and healing and hope on the page in front of you. And I'll tell you this, as a musician, there is something that's so important about me connecting with the lyrics of a song. And so often as a musician, we get stuck with the music in our head, and especially when you're trying to create new music. I will go around with music in my head all day long, and it's not until I'm actually writing it down, putting it on the page, that it suddenly becomes more real to me, and then I'm better able to assess what the music needs going forward. And it's the same thing with making sure to journal through the process of grief. That's the main primary encouragement that I want to leave people with, is just what you said, Pam. Do not feel grief, or excuse me, do not feel alone in this. Do not feel guilt, but in your grieving, allow yourself to grieve. Allow yourself to grieve for as much time as you need, but don't grieve alone in guilt.
Thank you, Katie. I think it was Maya Angelou who so beautifully said, there is no greater burden, but that you bear an untold story inside of you. And the Empty Arms Journal will show you how to tell your story in a guided step-by-step process, where you'll learn how to listen to your heart. You'll learn how to linger in the light with God. You'll learn how to look for the good in the midst of all this darkness, which is really important for grief breaks and the ability to breathe as you're grieving. You'll learn a lot of tools that I think will carry you along that path through the valley of shadows, and I hope it will be a point of encouragement for you. Katie, thank you so much. I know our listening audience is very grateful for your time, as I am. You are such a treasure, and we just send our love and hugs to you and Tim and the kids, and many, many thanks.
I just adore you, Pam. Thank you so much for the many, many ways that you help all of us. We love you. I love you very much. Thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you. Blessings. And we'll sign off now, but next Monday we'll be back with another live cast with my roommate, my best friend, aka my husband, John. And he'll be talking a little bit about how do husbands grieve after a pregnancy loss. Are there specific things that are unique to them? And he'll offer some tips for dads. For those of you that would like to turn in, we hope to see you then. God bless. Take good care.